After 40 years building my company from nothing, my son walked in with lawyers and declared, "You're retired today. We're transferring ownership." I said nothing, grabbed one bag and left the building. Next morning, they tried the accounts. Every password changed. 47 missed calls. Not a single answer. They thought the old man would just step aside. They were wrong. What they stole from me is about to cost them everything they never deserved. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is in your region right now. My name is Walter Price. I'm 68 years old, and I've lived in Dallas, Texas long enough to remember when the skyline was half this tall. I built things. That's what I do. Not a hobby. A life. For 40 years, I ran Price Construction Group out of a 7th-floor office on Commerce Street. And every single thing in that building, from the contracts on the walls to the coffee machine in the break room, existed because I made it exist. I'm not a man who talks much. My head foreman, Chris, used to say I could communicate an entire decision with one look. I always took that as a compliment. Now let me tell you about my son, Derek. He's 41. Sharp jaw, sharp suits, sharp opinions about everything. When he was 12, he used to ride with me on Saturday inspections, asking questions about load-bearing walls and concrete curing times, like he was studying for an exam. I thought that was the greatest thing in the world, a kid who wanted to understand what his father built. I spent 15 years answering every single one of those questions, and another 10 years handing him more responsibility than most men his age ever see. VP of Operations by the time he was 34. His business card said Price Construction Group across the top, and his name underneath mine. Somewhere in that second decade, the questions stopped. What replaced them was a particular kind of confidence, the kind that doesn't come from doing the work, but from watching someone else do it long enough to believe you understand it better than they do. Derek started finishing my sentences in meetings. Then he started having meetings I wasn't invited to. I noticed both things. I didn't comment on either of them yet. That's a habit of mine. Observe first, decide later. The job site teaches you that. A crack in a foundation beam doesn't need your opinion. It needs your measurement. Then there was Nicole, my daughter-in-law, 38 years old, law degree from SMU that she'd never once used in an actual courtroom. I always thought that made her more dangerous than if she had practiced. Working lawyers absorb humility over time. Clients who lose, judges who disagree, opposing counsel who are smarter on a given Tuesday. Nicole absorbed theory. She could cite Texas corporate statutes the way other people quote sports scores, fluently, confidently, and with absolute certainty that she was right. She had a particular smile she used on me, warm on the surface like a window you'd lean against until you realized the glass was cold, pleasant enough until the moment it wasn't useful anymore. I want to be fair about this. When Derek first brought her home, I thought she was exactly what he needed. Someone organized, someone who looked 5 steps ahead. I even told him that, which is not something I say lightly. What I couldn't see until later was the direction she was looking toward. Nicole had a specific idea of where the Price family should be standing in about 10 years, and that picture didn't include an older man with sawdust on his work boots, still holding the majority of the company he'd built. The first sign I should have taken more seriously came roughly 2 years before that Tuesday morning. Derek restructured the signatory authority on 2 of our operating accounts. He framed it as streamlining. I signed off because at the time the explanation was reasonable, and because I still trusted that the man with my name on his business card wasn't planning anything I needed to defend against. The second sign came a few months later, quarterly investor briefings that Derek started running himself, without looping me in until the summaries landed in my email the following day. He said it was giving me more time for the big picture. I let that go too. Then I found out about the valuation. Sandra, our company accountant, called me on a Sunday afternoon. She asked carefully whether I had authorized an outside firm called Meridian Analytics to access our full asset ledger. I told her I had not. She was quiet for a moment, then told me the access request had come from Derek's corporate email address. I thanked her. I hung up. I went back to my garage where I'd been building a cabinet from white oak, and I picked up the chisel I'd set down when the phone rang. I kept working for another 2 hours. Not because I wasn't thinking about what Sandra had said, I was thinking about nothing else, but because I've learned over a long time that panic is the most expensive reaction available to you, and I've never been able to afford it. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and wrote down everything I'd noticed over the previous 8 months. By the time I stopped, I had 2 full pages. I looked at them for a while. Then I flipped to a clean sheet and wrote one name at the top, and the next morning I made a phone call. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me finish telling you about that Tuesday. I parked in my usual spot in the garage below 4400 Commerce Street, rode the elevator to the 7th floor, nodded to the receptionist, and poured myself a coffee. The office smelled the way it always did: old wood, fresh paper, the faint chemical trace of blueprint copies. I'd been breathing that combination for 40 years. It was the closest thing I had to a signature scent. I was reviewing a subcontractor proposal when I heard the elevator open. 4 sets of footsteps moving together down the hallway with the specific rhythm of people who have rehearsed their entrance. I looked up through the glass panel of my office door. Derek. Nicole, positioned half a step behind him and slightly to his left, supporting role but present. And 2 men I'd never seen before, both in dark suits, both carrying leather portfolios the size of small briefcases. Lawyers carry documents the way surgeons carry instruments. You develop an eye for it. Derek opened my office door without knocking. That detail still stays with me. In 40 years, I had never once walked into another person's office without knocking. Not even rooms I legally owned. My father taught me that when I was 8 years old, and I had passed it along to Derek in exactly the same words. Apparently that particular lesson hadn't traveled as well as I thought. "Dad," he said it with a tone that had been prepared. Not warm, not cold. Something calibrated to sound reasonable. "We need to talk." I set my coffee down. "You brought an audience for a conversation." One of the lawyers made a small adjustment to his portfolio grip. Nicole's smile stayed exactly where it was. Derek placed a manila folder on my desk. Thick, color-coded tabs. The kind of document package that takes a team of people several weeks to assemble. He hadn't done this on impulse. "We've had the corporate structure reviewed," he said, his voice settling into the smooth register of someone delivering a speech they'd practiced. "And we believe, for the long-term health of the company, for its growth potential, that it's time for a formal leadership transition." I looked at the folder. I didn't touch it. "What that means practically," he continued, "is that we're initiating the ownership transfer process, effective today. You'll receive a very fair retirement arrangement, monthly distributions, full coverage, a consulting title if you want something on paper." A pause. Timed, I noticed. "Dad, you built something incredible here. It's time to let it grow into what it can become." I looked at him, then at Nicole, who was watching me with the careful patience of someone waiting to see whether a negotiation would be simple or complicated, then at the 2 lawyers who had both found a point on the wall above my head to study, then back at Derek. I counted 11 seconds in my head. I don't know why 11 specifically. It just felt like the right amount of silence for the occasion. Then I stood up, reached behind my chair, and picked up the black canvas bag I'd kept packed in my office closet for the past 3 months. Derek's eyes moved to the bag. Something crossed his face, the first unscripted expression of the morning. Confusion. Then the beginning of a much larger calculation he wasn't ready to finish yet. I didn't say a word. I walked to the door. One of the lawyers actually stepped sideways to give me clearance. I walked down the hallway, past the receptionist, who looked up at me with eyes that had gone very wide, and I stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. I stood in the silence of that small metal box and pulled out my phone. I opened a message thread and typed 6 words. Sent it. Put the phone back in my jacket pocket. Then I pressed the button for the parking garage. Whatever Derek was expecting from that morning, an argument, a negotiation, a signature, an emotional scene he could later describe as difficult but necessary. He didn't get any of it. He got an empty chair and a folder nobody had touched. I thought about that as the elevator descended. I thought he might not understand what it meant yet. He would. Here's something they don't teach you in business school. And I know this because Derek went to one. Trust doesn't break the way glass breaks. It doesn't shatter with a sound you can identify and say, there. That's the exact moment. It erodes. The way a foundation loses integrity when water gets into the wrong places over years. You keep walking across it, day after day, telling yourself the structure is holding. Then one morning you put your weight on a specific spot and feel the give, and you understand the whole thing has been shifting for a long time. The only question is whether you noticed soon enough to do something about it. The Sunday Sandra called me about the valuation request. That was the moment I understood what kind of ground I was standing on. I finished the cabinet I was working on before I did anything else. White oak, dovetail joints, a full day more of work. I don't explain this because I was calm about what Sandra had told me. I explain it because calm is a decision, not a condition, and if you're going to make decisions that matter, you have to choose it deliberately. I've been choosing it since I was 28 years old, and 14 people were depending on me to make the right call on a project, where the money had run thin and the deadline hadn't. That evening at my kitchen table, I wrote the list. Derek restructuring the signatory authority. I noted the date. The investor briefings that stopped, including me. I noted the first one, a comment Nicole had made at a family dinner about unlocking the company's real value, which at the time I'd taken for enthusiasm and now read differently. I noted that too. A phone call I'd overheard in the hallway outside the conference room where Derek had used the phrase, once the structure is simplified, in a context that had felt off to me but that I'd filed away without acting on. I noted it. By the time I ran out of items, I had 2 full pages and a very specific picture of how long this had been in motion. The next morning I called Glenn Foster. I hadn't known Foster personally. Sandra had mentioned his name once, maybe 18 months earlier, in passing. Described him as the kind of attorney who made other lawyers reconsider their positions before a hearing. I called his office, said my name, said I needed a meeting as soon as possible, and his assistant came back after 90 seconds with a slot 2 days out. I took it. His office was on the 15th floor of a building in Preston Center, corner suite, a view of North Dallas that you don't get by accident. Foster himself was 54, lean with a handshake that was brief and entirely to the point. I put 6 years of corporate documents on his conference table, originals, copies, everything organized by date, and said, "Tell me how exposed I am." He read for 2 hours. I had 3 cups of coffee and did not speak once. I've learned that lawyers are like job sites. You let them work, you don't interrupt with opinions they didn't ask for, and you wait until they're ready to tell you what they found. When Foster closed the last folder, he leaned back and looked at me with the expression of a man deciding how precisely to deliver bad news. "They have legal grounds," he said. "Not overwhelming grounds, but real ones. The current corporate structure, as it's written, creates a pathway where a shareholder resolution, paired with a specific transfer motion, could give your son operational control within roughly 60 days. He picked up his pen. "However, you still hold 51% of the voting shares, and your personal assets are not properly separated from the company's operating exposure." He looked up. "If we act now, both of those things are fixable." "How long?" I asked. 11 weeks, if we're careful." "Start this afternoon." What followed was the quietest 11 weeks of my professional life. No confrontations, no changed behavior. I drove to Commerce Street every morning, parked in the same spot, had coffee with the same people, reviewed the same proposals. Derek watched me across conference tables and saw exactly what he expected to see. An older man going through his days, maybe slowing down a little, not paying close enough attention. I was very deliberate about giving him that impression. Behind it, Foster and I were rebuilding everything from the inside. We moved my personal holdings, $1.87 million in accounts and property, into a revocable living trust that placed them outside the reach of the corporate action Derek was preparing. We restructured how my 51% voting stake was held, shifting it through a mechanism that sat outside the scope of the shareholder agreement his lawyers were building their case around. They were constructing a legal enclosure. Foster and I were quietly repositioning everything they thought they were going to enclose. I want to tell you about one evening during those 11 weeks, because I think it matters. I drove past the first building I ever finished, a 2-story commercial structure on the east side of Dallas. Nothing dramatic, nothing that made any architectural publication, just a solid, honest building that had been standing for nearly 4 decades and was now home to a dental practice. I'd built it with 11 people, a materials budget that had almost nothing left over, and 6 months of averaging 4 hours of sleep a night. I was 28 years old, and I had no idea if it was going to work. I sat in my truck in the parking lot and looked at it for a while. I thought about 12-year-old Derek riding with me on Saturday inspections, asking about load-bearing calculations, writing things down in a small spiral notebook he carried specifically for those trips. I still have a photograph from one of those Saturdays, both of us in hard hats on a half-finished site, squinting into the sun. He looked so genuinely interested in the world in that picture, like everything around him is a problem worth solving. I sat in that parking lot and tried to trace the line from that kid to the man who had practiced a speech to deliver to his own father with lawyers in the room. I couldn't find the single point where it turned. Maybe there wasn't one. Maybe it was water and time, the same as everything else. I decided it didn't matter. The reason was less important than the fact, and the fact required a response. The night before that Tuesday, I packed the black canvas bag, laptop, external hard drive with copies of every document Foster and I had prepared, a change of clothes, my charger. I put it in the corner of my office closet where I'd see it every morning, a reminder of what I'd already decided. Foster called me that same evening for a final review. We went through every item: account access transfers, trust registration confirmations, shareholder documentation. When we reached the end of the list, he paused. His pauses meant something, I'd learned. "There's a vulnerability," he said. One gap. If Derek files a specific emergency injunction within 72 hours of a formal confrontation, he could freeze your ability to act on the restructuring while the court reviews the validity of the trust transfers. A temporary freeze, but long enough to cause real problems. "How likely is he to know to do that?" I asked. "His attorneys have been working on this for months. I would assume they know." I looked out the kitchen window. The garage was dark. The cabinet I'd been building was still in there. White oak, nearly finished, patient as the wood it was made from. "Then we need a solution," I said, "before 72 hours become a problem." Foster told me what that solution might look like. It would require someone I hadn't spoken to in 11 years, someone who would have no particular reason to help me. I listened carefully, asked 3 questions, and said goodnight. Then I sat in my kitchen for another hour in the dark, running the arithmetic of it, checking every variable I could think of for the cracks. That's the habit that kept me in business for 40 years. Not optimism, not aggression, but the patient, thorough identification of what could go wrong and the construction of a response before it did. The next morning I drove to Commerce Street, parked in my usual spot, poured my coffee, and waited for my son to walk through my door. I already knew everything that was going to happen. I just needed him to start it. The loft I rented in Deep Ellum was small, bare, and completely without sentiment. 600 square feet on the second floor of a converted brick warehouse, with tall windows that faced east and let in enough morning light to read by without turning on a lamp. A bed, a table, 2 chairs, a coffee maker I'd bought the same evening I signed the lease. I'd moved in that same Tuesday night, directly from the Commerce Street garage. I want to be clear about something. I was not hiding. I had a perfectly good house in Plano. My house, mortgage paid off 11 years ago, my name on the deed. I could have driven there. I chose not to because I knew what would follow. The phone calls. Derek arriving at the door with the same lawyers and a different speech. Nicole standing slightly behind him with that carefully maintained expression of reasonable concern. I had no interest in that scene, and more importantly, I had no time for it. The clock Foster had described to me was running, so I sat in the loft at a table with my laptop and my phone and my coffee, and I waited for the morning to develop. The first call came at 7:22 a.m. Derek. I watched the screen light up and go dark. Then again at 7:31. Then 3 times in a row between 7:40 and 7:45, which told me he'd arrived at the office and found the first locked door. Then Nicole at 7:52. Then a number I didn't recognize. One of the lawyers, most likely, trying a line Derek hadn't thought to block. I counted. By the time the calls tapered off around 9 o'clock, there had been 47 of them. I poured a second cup of coffee. I want to be fair and say that part of me, some old stubborn piece of the man who taught his son to read blueprints on Saturday mornings, found no satisfaction in watching that number climb. That part of me understood what was happening on the other end of those calls. The confusion, the controlled panic that Derek would be managing very carefully in front of the lawyers, because showing panic in front of attorneys is expensive. The moment when he tried the corporate email portal for the first time, and the system returned an access denied message on an account he'd assumed was already his. The other part of me, the part that had spent 11 weeks quietly building a structure they couldn't dismantle, thought, well, now we see what 40 years of construction looks like when you actually read the foundation documents. At 7:58, a text from Sandra, my accountant. I think I understand what's happening. I'm not available to either party for comment. Good luck, Walter. Sandra was a practical woman. I appreciated that about her. At 9:47, the first formal communication arrived. Not a call, but an email from an attorney named Philip Graves, representing Derek Price in a matter of corporate governance dispute. It was 3 pages long, cited 4 Texas statutes, and used the phrase immediate remediation twice in the opening paragraph. I read it once, forwarded it to Foster with a single line. First shot. His response came back in 4 minutes. One word, expected. I set the phone down and looked out the east-facing windows for a while. Here's what I was thinking about, and it wasn't Derek. It was the IT manager, a young man named Trevor, who'd been with the company for 3 years, a careful and technically skilled person who I'd hired personally and who I knew had been in that office at 7:15 in the morning when Derek arrived. Trevor would have been the one to explain why the passwords didn't work. I had changed every account access the previous evening, all of them authorized through my own credentials, because I remained the legal account holder of every system the company used. Trevor would have had to look Derek in the face and say, in whatever careful phrasing he chose, that there was nothing he could do about it. I found myself hoping Trevor had delivered that information without excessive drama. He struck me as the kind of person who would. The 47th call came in at 9:03 and went unanswered like the previous 46. Then, just before noon, my phone buzzed with a different kind of notification, a legal alert from Foster's office monitoring system, which his assistant had set up to track filings in Dallas County. It flagged an emergency motion filed that morning in the 95th District Court. Petitioner, Derek A. Price. Respondent, Walter R. Price. I read the filing summary twice. Derek's attorneys had found the gap. Specifically, they had identified a procedural pathway under Texas Business Organizations Code that allowed a majority shareholder to challenge a trust transfer as a potential fraudulent conveyance if filed within a specific window. It was a narrow argument and not a strong one, but it didn't have to be strong. It only had to create a temporary freeze on the trust transfers while the court evaluated it. And if that freeze held for more than 48 hours without a counterfiling, Foster and I would lose our structural advantage. So Derek wasn't just making calls, he was working. I'd expected that. Somewhere beneath the frustration of finding every door locked, he'd had the presence of mind to sit down with his legal team and ask, "Where is the gap?" And they'd found one. I called Foster. "I see it," he said before I finished my sentence. "How serious?" "Manageable. But I need something from you tonight. There's only one way to counter this filing cleanly, and it requires a signature from a minority shareholder who can attest to the voluntary nature of the trust transfers." A pause. "Your brother, Roy Price. 63 years old, living in Fort Worth, holder of 9% of Price Construction Group's shares. Shares I had transferred to him 12 years ago at a family dinner, over Roy's mild protests, because I believed then that family ownership was a kind of insurance policy. I hadn't spoken to Roy in 11 years, not since a dispute over the settlement of our father's estate had ended a phone call with both of us saying things that were true and also permanent. We hadn't found our way back from them. I'll handle it, I told Foster. You have until midnight tomorrow. The counter-filing deadline is 11:59 p.m. I looked at the time on my laptop screen. 36 hours, roughly. Fort Worth was 45 minutes west on I-30 in reasonable traffic. I'll leave in the morning, I said. That night, I sat at the table in the loft with a blank legal pad and tried to figure out what I was going to say to my brother. I wrote 3 different versions of an opening and crossed out all of them. By 11 o'clock, I had decided to say nothing I hadn't prepared and nothing I didn't mean. That's the same approach I use on difficult job sites. No improvisation before you understand the structure, and no pressure you can't back up with load-bearing math. I set the legal pad aside and went to sleep. Fort Worth sits 45 minutes west of Dallas on a good morning, and that morning was good. Clear, dry, the kind of Texas spring weather that makes you understand why people live here despite everything else the climate has to offer. I drove with the radio off. I'd found over the years that silence before a difficult conversation is more useful than any preparation you can do with sound in the background. Roy's house was a single-story brick ranch in a quiet neighborhood in the Westover Hills area. Well-kept, mature live oaks in the front yard, a Ford pickup in the driveway that was newer than I expected. I pulled in behind it, sat for a moment, and then got out. He answered the door before I knocked, which meant he'd seen me pull in, which meant he'd been watching, which meant he'd been thinking about the possibility that I might show up. I filed all 3 of those facts away. Roy Price, at 63, looked the way our father had looked at 60. Same build, same jawline, same expression of careful neutrality that served as a general-purpose defense against the world. He was wearing work clothes, though it was barely 8 in the morning, which was either habit or a statement. With Roy, it was hard to tell the difference. "Walter," he said. "Roy." I nodded at the door. "Can I come in?" He considered this for what felt like 4 or 5 seconds, but was probably 2, then stepped back and held the door open. His kitchen was clean and functional. No decorative nonsense, just a table and 4 chairs and a coffee maker that looked like it had been purchased for its ability to produce coffee rather than its appearance. He poured 2 cups without asking. I sat down. He sat across from me and wrapped both hands around his mug and waited. "I need something from you," I said. No preamble. Roy had never responded well to preamble. I assumed. He looked at me evenly. "I heard about the situation." That surprised me slightly, though it shouldn't have. "From who?" "Sandra called me 3 days ago. Said there was something happening with the company and thought I should be aware." He paused. "She didn't tell me what to do about it, just that I should be aware." Sandra was more practical than I'd given her credit for. I made a note to acknowledge that later. I explained what I needed: the voting rights proxy, the counter-filing deadline, what his signature would accomplish legally. I kept it precise. Roy was an accountant by trade, retired now, and he understood financial documents better than most. I didn't need to simplify anything for him. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I drank about a third of my coffee. Roy looked out the kitchen window at the live oak in the backyard, an old wide tree that had been there since long before he'd moved into that house. Then he looked back at me. "Are you asking me because of the money?" he said. "Or because of something else?" I'd thought about this question during the drive. I'd considered several versions of the answer and rejected all of them for being either too strategic or not honest enough. In the end, I went with the one that was simply true. "Because he's your nephew," I said, "and he thinks there are no consequences to what he's done. I'd like to show him there are." Roy was quiet again. Then he said, "You know I'm still angry at you." "I know." "About the estate. About how that whole thing was handled." "I know that too." "And you're sitting in my kitchen asking for a favor." "Yes." He looked at me for another long moment. Then he got up, went to a drawer beside the refrigerator, and came back with a pen. "Show me where to sign." I slid the document across the table. The voting rights proxy agreement that Foster had drafted, and I had printed that morning at a FedEx on the way out of Dallas. Roy read it carefully, which took about 7 minutes. I sat and drank my coffee and did not rush him. When he reached the signature line, he paused once more. 24 months, he said, reading the term. 24 months, I confirmed. He signed, dated it, slid the document back across the table. "I'm still angry at you," he said again, but there was something different in the way he said it the second time. Less like a wall, and more like a marker someone had placed on a map. This is where we are, and we both know it. "That's fair," I said. I stood up, folded the document carefully, and put it in my jacket pocket. "I'll get out of your way." "You drove 45 minutes, Roy said. He topped off my coffee without asking. "Sit down." We sat at that kitchen table for another 40 minutes, and we did not talk about the estate, and we did not talk about what had happened 11 years ago. We talked about a few other things. His daughter in Austin, a remodel he'd been doing on the back bedroom, a question he had about a contractor who'd given him a quote that seemed either too low or too honest to be real. I told him which it probably was and why, and what to ask for in the contract. When I left, he walked me to my truck. "Good luck," he said, which was more than I'd expected. I drove back to Dallas with the signed document on the passenger seat and called Foster from I-30. "I have it," I told him. "Scan it and send it now," he said. "I'll file tonight, well before the deadline." I stopped at a FedEx on the west side of Dallas, scanned the document, and sent it to Foster's office. His assistant confirmed receipt at 6:14 p.m. Foster filed the counter-motion at 11:51 that night, 9 minutes before the deadline, which I suspected was deliberate on his part. Some people prefer their margins to carry a message. The next morning, Foster called to confirm the court had accepted the filing. "The emergency motion is neutralized," he said. "The judge will schedule a formal hearing in 3 to 4 weeks. Nothing can be frozen in the interim." He paused, which, with Foster, meant something was coming that required attention. "However, Derek's attorneys will have reviewed the counterfiling by now. They'll know you had the document ready. They'll know you anticipated the gap." "Yes," I said, "so they know you prepared. They'll start looking for what else you prepared." Another pause. "Mr. Price, the other shoe is about to come in. Whatever they haven't tried yet, expect it soon." I was sitting at the table in the deep elm loft, morning light coming through the east windows. My coffee was still hot. Outside, the neighborhood was starting its day. Foot traffic, a delivery truck idling in the alley below. The particular sound of a city that doesn't know anything has changed, but something had changed. I'd spent 11 weeks building quietly, and the morning Derek walked into my office, I had become the patient one. The one waiting for the next move rather than making it. That had been necessary and correct, but it was a holding position. You can't win from a holding position. You can only avoid losing. What Foster was telling me was that the ground had shifted. Derek now knew his father wasn't a man who walked out of a building and fell apart. He was starting to understand. He'd reached into a bag expecting to pull out something small and familiar, and found something else entirely. That meant the next move wouldn't be legal. It would be personal. I picked up my phone and looked up the name Foster had mentioned to me 2 weeks earlier. A private investigator in Dallas, a former financial crimes investigator who now worked corporate cases. Someone who could tell me, specifically and accurately, who Derek had been talking to, what deal he was trying to close, and what leverage he thought he still had. Because the thing about playing defense is that at some point you have to decide you're done playing it. I dialed the number. The call connected on the second ring. Daniel Vargas had an office in a building on Greenville Avenue that didn't advertise his services on the directory in the lobby. No sign on the door either, just a suite number. I appreciated that about him immediately. A private investigator who doesn't announce himself is probably better at the job than one who does. He was 46, medium height, with the kind of unhurried manner that comes from spending years watching people who don't know they're being watched. We shook hands across a desk that held a laptop, 2 phones, a legal pad, and nothing else. No photographs, no diplomas on the wall, no decorative items of any kind. The man kept his workspace the way I kept job sites. Function first, everything else optional. I explained what I needed, not the full history, just the relevant part. Someone was in the process of acquiring a stake in a Dallas construction company. The acquisition was contingent on a specific ownership condition being met, and I wanted to know who that someone was, what their track record looked like, and what the deal structure involved. I told him I needed it in a week, and that accuracy mattered more than speed. Vargas quoted me $4,500 a month, minimum 1 month, and said he'd have something preliminary in 5 days. I wrote him a check. He didn't tell me the case was interesting or that he'd do his best. He just opened his legal pad, asked 4 precise questions, and wrote down the answers. We shook hands again. I was out the door in 22 minutes. 3 days passed, then 5. On the evening of the 5th day, Vargas sent a single email with a PDF attached. No subject line, no greeting, just the document. I read it at the table in the deep elm loft, with a cup of coffee going cold beside me. The name at the top was Steve Larimore Bolton, a Houston-based venture investor, 51 years old, with a portfolio that included commercial real estate, regional logistics, and what the document described, with careful neutrality, as asset restructuring. Vargas had pulled Bolton's track record from public business filings, court records, and trade publications. The picture was specific and not flattering. Over the previous 5 years, Bolton had been the lead investor in 4 separate mid-sized companies. 3 of them had been dissolved or sold at a loss within 18 months of his acquisition. The 4th was still technically operating, but had shed 60% of its staff. In each case, Bolton's investment was recovered through asset sales before the dissolution. The businesses themselves, the people, the contracts, the reputations, had not survived the process. I set the document down and looked out the east windows for a while. Here's what I was thinking. Derek was 41 years old and smart enough to have run a company's operations for a decade. He had gone to business school. He was not, by any reasonable measure, naive. Which meant one of 2 things was true. Either he had done his due diligence on Bolton and decided that the risks were acceptable, that he, Derek, was different from the previous companies, that he could manage a Bolton investment without the same outcome, or he hadn't done the due diligence. He'd seen $3.2 million and a clean exit path for his father and had simply stopped looking. Both explanations were possible. The second one was more likely and also more dangerous, for Derek specifically, though he didn't know that yet. I called Foster the next morning and described what Vargas had found. Foster was quiet for a moment. Bolton's been clean on the public side, he said. No fraud, no regulatory action. The company's failed, but that's not illegal. I know, I said. I'm not interested in what he did. I'm interested in what he's about to do. Another pause. You want to warn him off. I want him to make an informed decision, I said, anonymously. Foster considered this. A memorandum, he said slowly. Corporate status disclosure. The kind of document that any potential investor would want to review before committing capital. He paused again. That's entirely standard. There's nothing improper about a party with material interest in a company's corporate structure providing documentation to a potential investor. That's what I thought, I said. Foster drafted the memorandum over the following 2 days. It was 6 pages, precise, factual, without interpretation. It documented the current state of Price Construction Group's corporate structure, my 51% voting stake, the pending trust transfer dispute, the court filing and counterfiling, and the 3-week delay in the hearing schedule. It did not contain any legal conclusions. It simply laid out what was true and let the reader draw their own conclusions. A prudent investor would draw them quickly. We delivered it to Bolton's office through Foster's firm, using a disclosure letterhead that identified the sender only as a party with material shareholder interest. Bolton's assistant confirmed receipt. 2 days later, Vargas, who had been keeping a loose eye on Bolton's calendar, reported that Bolton's scheduled meeting with Derek had been postponed indefinitely. No reason given. I found out what happened next, not from Vargas, but from Foster, who heard it from a contact in the Dallas legal community within a week. Derek had apparently called Bolton directly to ask about the postponement. Bolton had told him in general terms that he'd received documentation suggesting the deal carried legal complications he hadn't been aware of. He hadn't told Derek where the documentation came from. Derek, according to Foster's contact, had been brief and very controlled on that call, which meant, in my experience of my son, that he was furious and working hard not to show it. He didn't know it was me. Not yet. but I suspected he had a strong intuition. The question was what he'd do with that intuition, and I didn't have to wait long for the answer. Chris Malloy called me on a Thursday evening. I was in the loft, reviewing some documents Foster had sent over, when his name appeared on my screen. Chris was not a man who called without a reason, so I picked up on the first ring. Derek pulled me into a meeting today, he said without preamble. Chris was built the same way I was. No wasted words, no build-up. Closed door, just the two of us. He told me he needed a public statement of support from me, in writing, for the investors, he said. Something confirming that the operational leadership transition was voluntary and professionally supported. What did you tell him? I told him I needed a few days to think about it. A pause. He didn't love that answer. He said if I needed time, he'd understand, but that if my position turned out to be, his word, ambiguous, he'd have to make some restructuring decisions. He had a check ready, $18,000, sitting on the desk in front of him like a prop. I could picture Derek doing exactly that, the check placed with deliberate casualness, visible from the moment you walked in, never directly mentioned until it needed to be. Nicole had probably suggested the staging. She understood theater. He's buying your loyalty or eliminating you, I said. That's how I read it. Another pause. Walter, I've been the foreman on 7 major builds with this company. I know every subcontractor in our network, every supplier relationship, every quirk in our project management system. If he thinks a one-time check covers that. Chris didn't finish the sentence. How long do you actually need? I asked. I don't need 3 days. I needed to buy myself time to call you. I set down the document I'd been reviewing. I looked at the wall of the loft for a moment and thought about how to say what I needed to say without it sounding like a pitch. The last thing I wanted was for Chris to feel like he was being recruited against his will, or that I was simply using him as a countermove. He deserved better than that, and it was also bad strategy. Chris, I said, I'm starting a new company. Not eventually. I've already begun. The structure is in place, the capitalization is in place, and I have a clear operating plan. What I need is a head foreman who understands from the first day what we're building and why. I paused. I'm not asking for your loyalty. I'm offering you a job. Starting salary is $112,000 a year, plus 3% of the net on the first completed project. The line was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. I counted. When do we start? Chris said. Come to Deep Ellum on Monday morning. Bring whatever you need. We'll talk through the specifics. After the call ended, I sat at the table for a few minutes. Chris Malloy had spent 20 years with Price Construction Group. He knew where every body was buried, every shortcut that had been taken, every subcontractor who delivered, and everyone who didn't. That knowledge wasn't leverage. It was just competence. The kind that takes 2 decades to accumulate and walks out the door in one afternoon when you treat the person who carries it like a line item. Derek would discover this within the week, probably sooner. The next morning I drove to a Texas Secretary of State filing office and completed the registration for Price-Built LLC, Dallas, Texas. Registered agent, Glenn Foster's firm. Initial capitalization, $340,000 from my personal accounts. Specifically funds that had been outside the corporate structure long before the previous month's events. Clean, documented, unimpeachable. Standing at the counter, signing the final registration form, I had a thought that I found genuinely entertaining. Every document Derek had prepared over the past months, every legal structure his attorneys had constructed, every corporate maneuver they'd designed, all of it had been aimed at a single target, Price Construction Group, the legal entity at 4400 Commerce Street. They had spent months building a cage around a specific address, and I had simply stopped being at that address. I picked up the registration certificate, folded it, and put it in my jacket pocket, walked back to my truck, drove to Deep Ellum. 2 days later, Foster called. Derek's attorneys filed a request for a corporate records disclosure this morning, he said. Standard process, they're fishing. But they'll find the LLC registration within the day. It's a public filing. I know, I said. When they find it, they'll move to the next question, which is whether there's a non-compete agreement that restricts your ability to operate in the same market. A brief pause. I've reviewed all your corporate documents from the past 10 years. I haven't found one. There isn't one, I said. I never signed a non-compete in my life. I own the company. You don't sign non-competes with yourself. Correct. But Derek's attorneys don't know that yet. Foster's tone had the particular quality it got when he was about to tell me something he'd already planned for. They'll file a motion claiming one exists within 48 to 72 hours of finding the LLC registration. I'd expect it by the end of the week. And when they do, we respond, with the complete absence of any such agreement in the corporate records. He paused again. Unless, of course, they produce one. I looked out the loft windows. The afternoon light on the brick buildings of Deep Ellum was going orange at the edges. They won't produce one, I said. No, Foster agreed. They probably won't. But the way he said it, carefully with one beat of silence before the word probably, told me he wasn't entirely certain. And Foster, in my experience, was not a man who used words carelessly. I spent the rest of that day reviewing every document in my personal files, physical and digital, everything I'd ever signed in relation to Price Construction Group. By 9 o'clock that evening, I had confirmed what I already knew. There was no non-compete agreement. I had never signed one. What I didn't know, and what kept me at the table in the loft past midnight, was whether someone might claim otherwise, and whether, if they did, they'd have a document to show for it. That question would have an answer sooner than I expected. The document arrived on a Monday morning, delivered by courier to Foster's office at Preston Center. Not emailed, not filed electronically. Physical delivery. Paper copy. The kind of move that's designed to feel official and final. Foster called me within the hour. Derek's attorneys have submitted a non-compete agreement, he said. They claim you signed it during the 2019 corporate restructuring. 5-year term, full market restriction. If it holds, Price Built LLC cannot operate in commercial or residential construction in the Dallas metro area until 2024. A pause, which would already have passed, except they're arguing the clock starts from the date of enforcement, not the date of signing. I sat with that for a moment. Send me the document, I said. The PDF arrived in my email 6 minutes later. I opened it on my laptop at the table in the loft. I read it slowly, twice. My signature was at the bottom of page 3, Walter R. Price, in my handwriting, above a line that read, Owner and sole member, Price Construction Group. The date beside the signature read, March 14th, 2019. I stared at that signature for a long time. Here's what I knew with absolute certainty. I had never signed a non-compete agreement. Not in 2019. Not ever. Not in relation to my own company. You don't restrain yourself from competing with a business you own. The concept is legally absurd on its face. But there was my signature, and there was a notarial stamp beside it, and there was a date that said March 14th, 2019, a date I could not immediately disprove. I called Foster back. The signature looks genuine, I told him. I want to know about the notarization. I'm already on it, he said. I've requested the commission records from the Texas Secretary of State's notary database for the individual whose stamp appears on the document. I'll have them by tomorrow afternoon. I didn't sleep particularly well that night, not because I was afraid. I'd done nothing that required a non-compete, and I had signed nothing of the kind, but because I understood what was happening. Someone had taken my signature from a real document, probably something routine from the 2019 restructuring period, and had used it to construct a fabricated one. That required planning. It required access to original documents, and it required a level of commitment to the outcome that went well beyond what Derek would typically do on his own. The next afternoon, Foster called again. His voice had a quality I hadn't heard from him before. Not quite satisfaction, but the particular controlled energy of a man who has found exactly what he was looking for. The notary whose stamp appears on the document, he said, is a woman named Patricia Aldridge. She received her notary commission from the state of Texas in September of 2019. A deliberate pause. The document is dated March 14th, 2019, 6 months before she was commissioned. I set my coffee down. She couldn't have notarized the document in March 2019, I said. She didn't have a license in March 2019. Correct. The stamp is genuine. It belongs to her. The date is fabricated. Someone used her stamp, which would have been accessible after her commissioning, and backdated the document to a point before she legally existed as a notary. Another pause. Mr. Price, this is document falsification under Texas Penal Code Section 37.10. It's a state jail felony. I looked out the east windows. The morning was gray, overcast, the kind of Dallas spring day that can't decide whether it wants to rain. Who knows about this document? I asked. On their side, at minimum, the two attorneys who submitted it, possibly others. Foster's tone remained even. I'm filing a complaint with the Texas Secretary of State's Notary Division today. I'm also filing a motion with the 95th District Court to have the document declared void, and a separate complaint alleging fabrication of evidence. Simultaneously, a brief pause. The attorneys who submitted this document are about to have a conversation with their ethics board that they will not enjoy. I thought about Derek. I thought about the signed document, the prepared speech, the two lawyers standing in my office with their portfolios. All of it built on a plan that had looked airtight from the inside. I thought about Nicole, her law degree, her specific practical knowledge of Texas corporate procedure, her understanding of what documents existed and where they were kept. File everything, I told Foster. Today. He filed the complaints within 3 hours. By the end of the week, the two attorneys who had submitted the document, a firm called Graves and Whitmore, had contacted the court to request a procedural delay, citing the need to review newly available information. That's what lawyers say when they've realized the ground under them has shifted and they need time to find a new position. The court scheduled a formal hearing for several weeks out. In the interim, the non-compete motion was stayed. Price Built LLC continued to operate without restriction. Derek's attorneys, in the days that followed, became very quiet. No new filings, no calls to Foster's office, nothing. After the controlled aggression of the previous weeks, the silence was louder than anything they could have said. But it was the wrong kind of silence, not the silence of withdrawal, the silence of regrouping. And I had learned from a long time building things that had to withstand pressure that the most dangerous moment in any structure isn't when it's being stressed, it's the pause before the secondary failure. Nicole, it turned out, had not been sitting still. Vargas called me on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Foster filed the fabrication complaints. He didn't waste time with context. Nicole Price made 2 in-person visits last week, he said. I have her on both. First one was to a commercial property management firm called Meridian Square Properties. They hold the contract for the Garland Avenue Civic Center renovation, $1.1 million, currently under Price Construction Group. Second visit was to a development group called Harwell Partners. They've got 2 active projects with the company, combined value just under $900,000. What was she telling them? I asked. I don't have audio, but I have her on entry and exit times at both offices, and I have something else. A pause. The project manager at Meridian Square, a man named Kevin Aldridge, no relation to the notary. He reached out to me directly after Nicole's visit. He'd looked up the LLC registration for Price Built, and when he saw the filings, he started asking questions. He wanted to know who was actually in control of Price Construction Group. What did you tell him? Nothing. I told him I'd relay his questions to the appropriate party. Vargas paused again. He wants to talk to you. I drove to Meridian Square Properties office on the following morning. Their project manager, Kevin Aldridge, was a practical, no-nonsense man in his early 50s who had been managing municipal contracts for 15 years and had a very refined instinct for when a contractor relationship was about to become a problem. He shook my hand, offered me a seat, and got directly to the point. A woman came to see me last week, he said. She identified herself as being associated with Price Construction Group leadership. She told me the company was going through a governance transition, that there was an ongoing dispute about ownership, and that given the uncertainty, there might be delays in the Garland Avenue project. He looked at me steadily. She suggested we might want to consider pausing our payment schedule until the situation clarified. Nicole had been here, in this office, talking to this man about my company. What exactly did she say about the dispute? I asked. She was careful. Nothing she said was technically false, I think, but the framing was designed to make me nervous. He leaned back slightly. Mr. Price, I've been in this business long enough to recognize when someone is trying to make a contract look fragile. She was doing that. I reached into my jacket and placed 2 documents on his desk. The first was the certified shareholder confirmation showing my 51% voting stake. Current, notarized, filed with the state. The second was the court's preliminary stay of the non-compete motion, which effectively confirmed that no enforceable restriction on Price-Built's operations had been established. Aldridge read both documents carefully. He was the kind of man who actually read things, which I respected. "So you're still the controlling shareholder," he said. "Yes. And Price-Built LLC is a separate operating entity I've established. Fully licensed, fully capitalized, no legal encumbrances." I paused. "If Meridian Square wants to ensure continuity on the Garland Avenue project, I can offer Price-Built as an authorized subcontractor effective immediately. Same crew, same materials suppliers, same project timeline. The work doesn't stop." He considered this for a moment, a genuine, careful consideration, not theater. Then he nodded once. "I'll need the LLC's licensing, documentation, and insurance certificates," he said. "You'll have them by end of day." I left that office with the Garland Avenue contract redirected to Price-Built as a subcontractor. $1.1 million that had been trembling on the edge of Nicole's interference, now stable again. The municipal payment schedule resumed the following week, but 2 other clients, the ones Nicole had also visited, had already pulled back. Harwell Partners had sent a formal notice of contract review to Price Construction Group, which effectively froze the payments on their 2 projects. Total exposure, just under $900,000. Derek apparently had not been aware of Nicole's visits until the notices arrived. Vargas told me, through a source in the building's lobby, that the exchange at the Commerce Street office between Derek and Nicole the afternoon the Harwell notice came in had been audible through a closed door. I didn't take any satisfaction in that specifically, but I noted it. The following morning, Foster called with something that changed the temperature of everything. "The court has scheduled a deposition date for Nicole Price in the document fabrication matter," he said. 6 weeks out. The question before the court is whether the non-compete agreement was knowingly submitted as a falsified document, and who bears responsibility for the fabrication. Can they trace it to her? That depends on what the document examination reveals. The forensic analysis we requested is in progress. It will determine whether the stamp was applied at the same time as the rest of the document or separately, and whether any alterations were made to the original underlying document from which your signature was taken. A pause. If the analysis shows what I think it will show, Nicole Price will walk into that deposition room with very few good answers available to her. I sat with that for a moment. "How is Derek positioned in this?" I asked. "He submitted the document through his attorneys. Whether he knew it was falsified is a separate question. His attorneys are currently, and quite urgently, trying to determine the answer to that question themselves." Foster's tone was precise and dry. "The word I'm hearing is that Graves and Whitmore may be withdrawing from representation. Conflict of interest." I looked at the wall of the loft. Outside, Dallas was going about its afternoon. Trucks on the street below, the distant sound of construction from somewhere east. Someone else's project. Someone else's crew. Derek had started this with lawyers in a room and a prepared speech. He was ending it without lawyers, and without a speech. The distance between those 2 points was entirely of his own construction. And Nicole, who had come into this as the strategist, the one with the legal education and the long-range thinking, was about to sit across a table from a court-appointed examiner and explain a notary stamp that was 6 months older than the notary who owned it. I was not the one who had put her there. She had put herself there. But I would be watching. The deposition hearing was held in a conference room on the 4th floor of the Dallas County Civil Courts building. A spare, functional space with a long table, fluorescent lighting, and the particular atmosphere of a room where people come to answer questions they would prefer not to answer. I arrived early. Foster was already there, arranging his documents with the quiet precision of a man who has done this many times and finds it neither exciting nor unpleasant, simply necessary. Nicole arrived with a single attorney, not one of the Graves and Whitmore lawyers who had submitted the non-compete document. Those two had withdrawn from the case the previous week, citing conflict of interest, which is the legal profession's polite way of saying they had learned something that made continued representation inadvisable. Nicole's new counsel was a woman named Diane Castillo, competent and composed, who had clearly been brought in quickly and was working with what she'd been given. Nicole herself looked exactly as I expected. Composed, professionally dressed, dark jacket, minimal jewelry, a posture that communicated controlled calm rather than actual calm. She glanced at me when she entered the room. It was a brief glance, the kind that carries calculation rather than emotion. She was assessing, not reacting. I had to respect the discipline, even if I didn't respect much else. The forensic document examiner's report had arrived 4 days earlier. Foster had reviewed it with me over the phone, reading the key findings in his precise, unembellished way. The conclusion, the notary stamp on the non-compete document, had been applied to the paper at a different time than the underlying text. The ink composition and impression depth were inconsistent with simultaneous application. Additionally, the signature had been digitally extracted from a 2019 routine shareholder consent form and overlaid onto the fabricated document. The original consent form, which I did have a copy of in my personal files, matched the extracted signature exactly. Someone had built a forged document from parts of a real one, precisely, carefully, with specific legal knowledge of what language a non-compete agreement needed to contain to be enforceable under Texas law. Patricia Aldridge, the actual notary whose stamp appeared on the document, arrived as a witness 40 minutes into the proceeding. She was 53 years old, wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and had the manner of someone who had been troubled by this situation since she first learned her name was attached to a document she had never touched. She confirmed clearly and without hesitation that she had not notarized any agreement between Walter Price and Price Construction Group at any time, under any circumstances. She further confirmed that her commission had been issued in September of the relevant year, and that she had not been legally authorized to notarize any document prior to that date. The examining judge asked Nicole directly, had she been aware at the time the document was submitted to the court that the notarization date preceded the notary's commissioning? Nicole's attorney objected on grounds of self-incrimination. The objection was noted. The hearing proceeded. What I watched over the next hour was the slow, methodical dismantling of something that had been constructed with considerable care. The document examiner's testimony, the commissioning records, the original 2019 consent form, placed beside the fabricated agreement, the extracted signature visible in both, identical in every detail of stroke and pressure. The judge reviewed each piece of evidence with the unhurried attention of someone who finds the arithmetic straightforward and is simply confirming what it adds up to. Nicole's composure held through most of it. I watched her closely, not with satisfaction exactly, but with the focused attention of someone who has been waiting a long time to see a structure tested under real load. Her jaw was set. Her hands, folded on the table in front of her, were motionless. Her attorney made several objections, all noted, none of them changing what the document said. Near the end of the hearing, there was one moment when Nicole's expression shifted. It was when the judge placed the two documents side by side, the original consent form and the fabricated non-compete, and observed aloud that the signature extraction was evident to the naked eye once you were looking for it. Something moved across Nicole's face in that moment. Not panic. Something quieter and more permanent than panic. The look of a person who has understood, fully and finally, that the structure they built has failed, and that the failure is not recoverable. It lasted about 2 seconds. Then the composure returned. But I had seen it. The judge declared the non-compete agreement void and unenforceable. The matter of document fabrication was referred to the Dallas County District Attorney's Office for review. The hearing was closed. In the corridor afterward, Foster walked beside me toward the elevator, without speaking until we were inside and the doors had closed. "The DA referral is significant," he said. "They may or may not pursue charges. That's not our decision. But the referral is in the public record. I nodded. Graves and Whitmore will likely face an ethics board review as well, he added. Whether they knew the document was falsified before submitting it, or whether they were deceived by their own client, either answer is a problem for them. The elevator reached the lobby. We walked out into the Dallas afternoon. Warm, clear, the kind of weather that makes no particular statement about anything. Price Built LLC is fully clear, Foster said. No encumbrances, no challenges, no pending motions. You can operate without restriction. Good, I said. Then after a pause, send me your invoice for the month. Foster almost smiled. For him, that was significant. That evening, sitting at the table in the Deep Ellum loft, I found a letter in my email inbox from a Houston address. I didn't recognize it first. Then I saw the name in the sender field. S.L. Bolton. I read it twice. Then I set my phone down and looked out the east windows for a long time. Bolton's letter was 4 paragraphs. No wasted language, no apology, no explanation of how he'd arrived at his position. Just the proposal. An investment of $2.8 million in Price Built LLC in exchange for a 28% equity stake, with the founder retaining full operational control. One condition, clean, documented corporate structure. No contested ownership, no pending litigation, which, as of that afternoon, I had. I didn't respond immediately. I had learned a long time ago that the right answer to an important question isn't the first answer that comes to mind. It's the one that survives 2 days of scrutiny. I spent those 2 days doing exactly what I'd done at the beginning of all this, running the numbers, checking the logic, looking for the cracks. I had Foster pull Bolton's background more thoroughly than Vargas had. Current portfolio, recent filings, anything that had changed since the original report. The picture had shifted. Bolton's 3 failed investments were still on his record, but his 4th, the one still technically operating, had stabilized under new management that he'd installed after a board restructuring. Not a recovery, but not a dissolution either. A man who had learned something from a series of mistakes, possibly. I also looked at what Price Built actually needed. $340,000 of initial capitalization was enough to register the company and begin the Plano residential project. But if we were going to scale, if Price Built was going to become what Price Construction Group had been at its best, we needed capital for equipment, bonding, expanded subcontractor relationships. $2.8 million, structured correctly, was exactly the kind of injection that made that possible without surrendering control. I met Bolton in person twice. First meeting, his office in Houston, a drive I made alone, which told me something about how he preferred to conduct business. He was direct, pragmatic, and notably undramatic. No speeches about vision or potential or unlocking value. He wanted a return on his investment over a 7-year horizon. He wanted quarterly reporting and board observer status, no voting rights. He had done his homework on Price Built's existing contracts and the Plano project timeline. Second meeting, Foster's office in Dallas, with documents on the table. We negotiated 2 points in the term sheet, the reporting frequency and the buyout provision, and reached an agreement in 90 minutes. Foster filed the investment documentation with the state the following morning. $2.8 million arrived in the Price Built LLC operating account within the week. While all of this was in motion, Price Construction Group, the legal entity still technically under Derek's operational control, was coming apart in the particular way that companies come apart when their foundation has been removed and the walls are still standing for a moment out of habit. The 3 municipal contracts that Nicole's client visits had destabilized, never fully recovered. 2 of them were formally reassigned to other contractors. The 3rd went to Price Built directly, through a competitive bid process that Chris Malloy ran, with the precision of someone who had been doing this for 20 years and knew exactly what number to put on the proposal. The bank that held Price Construction Group's credit line, $620,000, sent a formal notice of review after the public court proceedings. The fabrication referral was in the record. That kind of thing changes a risk calculation. The credit line was withdrawn within 3 weeks of the notice. Derek, from what I understood through Foster and through Vargas's final report, spent several weeks attempting to sell Price Construction Group as a going concern. He contacted 4 potential buyers. None of them moved past the preliminary stage. The combination of pending legal exposure, withdrawn credit, lost contracts, and the absence of any operational leadership. Chris was gone. The IT manager had submitted his resignation. 2 of the senior project managers had quietly moved to Price Built, made the company difficult to value and impossible to recommend. The name still existed. The licenses were still technically active, but the substance had left the building months ago in a black canvas bag. On a Tuesday evening in late autumn, my phone rang. "Derek," I answered. He spoke first. His voice was controlled, but the control was the kind that takes visible effort, the kind you can hear working. He said he wanted to understand what had happened. He said he thought there might be a conversation worth having. He said that whatever had occurred between them, I was still his father. I listened to all of it without interrupting. I've always been good at that. When he finished, I said, "Derek, I didn't leave the company. I took it with me. Price Built is Price Construction Group. The contracts, the crew, the relationships, the 40 years of work. All of it came with me when I walked out. What you have at Commerce Street is the letterhead. You're welcome to it." A pause. "Price Built," I said, "is Price Construction. Minus you. Minus Nicole." I hung up. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment, because I think precision matters here. It was not triumph. It was not anger finally released, or a score finally settled. It was closer to what I feel when I finish a piece of furniture that I've been working on for a long time. The particular quiet that comes when the last joint fits correctly and the structure is finally complete. Not excitement. Just the clean, solid confirmation that the thing you built is sound. 2 weeks later, Price Built LLC completed the Plano residential project, a 48-unit complex on the north side, finished on schedule within the $4.1 million budget, 0 punch list items at final inspection. Chris Malloy walked every unit personally on the last day. That's how he's always worked. I stood at the back of the lobby on the ground floor while the project manager from the development group did his walkthrough, and I watched Chris answer questions with the exact, unhurried competence of a man who knows his work. I wrote Chris a check that afternoon. His 3% of net profit on the project came to just over $31,000 on top of his salary. He looked at it for a moment, then folded it and put it in his shirt pocket without ceremony. That's how he's always worked, too. I also wrote a check to Roy. $15,000. Plain envelope, note inside that said, "For the signature at the right moment." He called me 2 days after it arrived. We talked for 40 minutes. Not about the estate, not about what had happened 11 years ago. We talked about his back bedroom remodel. The contractor had done decent work, and about a fishing trip he was planning in the spring, and whether I might want to join him. I said I'd think about it. The following Saturday, I drove back to the house in Plano for the first time since April. The garage was exactly as I'd left it. The white oak cabinet, the one I'd been working on the Sunday Sandra called about the valuation, was still on the workbench, waiting. I put on my work apron, picked up the rubbing block, and spent the afternoon on the finish. When that was done, I pulled out a fresh piece of Texas white oak I'd been storing for the right project. Wide grain, clear face, no defects. I set it on the bench and looked at it for a while. Then I picked up the hand plane and started on a table. Not for anyone. Not for a room I was trying to furnish or a client I was trying to impress. Just because I wanted to build something, and I had the time, and the wood was good. That's the thing about building from the ground up, the first time and the second time, and however many times it takes. You don't do it to prove something to someone who doubted you. You do it because it's what you know how to do, because the work is honest and the result is real, and at the end of it, you have something that wasn't there before, something that holds. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.